Aside from education, aside from rewiring the state through devolution and changing the very structure of our political landscape, I think the most important thing is reforming our politics itself because it is so influenced by corporate lobbying and corporate finance that the priorities of the people become completely neglected. That's why we need a cap on political donations to make sure that no one can have outsized influence on our politics. But I still think, even though there's a lot of skepticism about this, that even a measure like that won't be enough to change our politics. I think we do need to move towards state funding of political parties because as long as donations exist, there will always be someone who has undue influence on the direction of travel. Everyone should have equal say in how things are run and how our country is governed. Isn't that the essence of democracy? Isn't that how democracy should function? Giving everyone an equal voice and equal power to influence change. I think that we truly need to do that. But also, and Andy Burnham has expressed support for this, we need to radically change the House of Lords. The House of Lords is bloated and it has so many people who do not even bother to attend. So many old people there, so many old grandees and political loyalists that do not contribute to the legislative process, which are still paid astronomical amounts and have the privilege of calling themselves lords and baronesses and nobles. This is an archaic system that doesn't befit a country that is looking to move forward into a future of prosperity and progress. That's why the idea that even Keir Starmer has supported in the past, the idea of an assembly of the nations and regions to actually bring the local leaders that Andy Burnham wants to empower directly to the center of power, the heart of government, through an assembly of the nations and regions in what was formerly the House of Lords. That would really be a transformative change. And you know why? Because it would allow our politics to finally have representation from all parts of our country. And it would allow proper scrutiny, not just political patronage disguised as political competence, because that's what it is. It's just prime ministers and governments giving rewards to people who have been loyalists to them. That's not how politics should function. But I think that House of Lords reform is a notoriously arduous and difficult process that derails the government from its other priorities. That's why some key interim measures I will propose right now are essential to making sure that we pave the way towards radical reform, but that we do not go too quickly and risk derailing the progress of the government. And it starts with removing every single member who does not contribute to the House of Lords. That means people who have below a certain level of attendance should not be allowed to attend. The second thing is introducing an age limit to the House of Lords to ensure that we are not having old people that are sleeping in the House of Lords and not contributing much to the legislative process. And then third, a comprehensive review into every single member to make sure that every single member of the House of Lords is contributing. We do have an independent committee in the House of Lords that looks into appointments and similar processes. We could use that very committee to make sure that every member of the House of Lords is contributing to improving the legislative process. And that is how we should do it in the interim. But afterwards, what we need to do is change the House of Lords itself to a more representative and fair system so that it can hold our government accountable and make sure that we drive progress, not move back to the failures of the past. The next step is to change taxation. Our taxation system burdens ordinary working people far too much. Assets are not taxed enough at all, and that's why they have pooled in the hands of a privileged few. The wealth of this elite cadre of people who own all the assets of our country, especially housing, which has become increasingly inaccessible to ordinary people. This is an issue that has to be tackled if Andy Burnham is truly serious about improving living standards in our country. Harry Stevenson has been on a bit of a media blitz over the past few days after his documentary's been released, and I really do recommend it. It's a really great watch. It clearly emphasizes that there is a huge problem with wealth inequality and is driven by asset ownership. People who own the assets have all the economic power. We have to make housing and assets affordable and accessible to ordinary people again. And the idea of a wealth tax is so important for that. And Andy Burnham has signaled that he may be willing to implement such a measure. And what this would do is it would allow assets to be accessible to ordinary people, as wealthy people would finally look to sell off these assets. And it would also reduce the amount of gains they're making in passive income from these assets. Some wealthy people, like the man in Gary Stevenson's documentary, have expressed the fact that they are not willing to take anything less than 15% in interest. This level of gain in such a short period of time is bound to accelerate inequality. And what you see above a certain level of wealth is that wealth is not spent productively anymore, not in productive assets or investment, nor in productive consumption either. It's funneled into assets and it fuels inequality and it fuels financial instability. That is how inequality continues to grow. That's why we need radical change. Above a certain point, wealth does not contribute positively to the economy and it only has negative effects. I don't know exactly what that point is, but economists like Gabriel Zuckman have suggested that that point is £100 million. Similarly, in her book Limitarianism, Ingrid Robbins suggested that no one should have wealth above 10 million. I think that that's a little bit extreme, but I do recognize that we do have a problem and we do need something like an extreme wealth line because merely a wealth tax on its own is not going to solve the problems that we face because it's so negligible in its impact that a lot of wealthy people still won't sell their assets. A lot of wealthy people will still have their wealth continue to grow at astronomical levels. And without changing the tax system itself, and without limiting extreme wealth, we cannot see the transformative change that we need. We have to first make sure that our tax system is fair. That means reducing the burden of taxation on ordinary people's incomes. That means cutting the high marginal rates of tax, and by that I mean income tax, by removing the personal allowance withdrawal penalty for high earners. That would signal a decisive shift by reducing marginal tax rates for high earners and allowing them to retain more of their income and improve their living standards. What we need also is cuts to the rates of income tax and changes to the thresholds of income tax to allow ordinary people to have more money in their pockets. And alongside that, we have to increase capital gains tax to the same level as income tax so that we do not discriminate against some people in our society who earn from different means. But still, I believe they do have to be taxed at the same level. Because why should workers bear the brunt? Why should workers contribute more when they are in the most difficulty? The second step is, of course, the wealth tax to make sure that people who own wealth as a source of their prosperity pay their fair share. The broadest shoulders bear the greatest burden. That is so important too. And beyond that, what we also need, in my opinion, is an extreme wealth line. Something like, let's say, even 500 million, maybe even a billion. No one above that point should have any wealth. Maybe we should have 100% tax above that. And why is that so important? Why is that so beneficial? It's because above a certain point, wealth is not used productively, as I mentioned before, but also extreme wealth itself is damaging because it contributes to environmental breakdown because most spending at the high tier of society is diverted towards luxury goods. It's diverted towards things like private jets and swimming pools, which has such a negative environmental impact. Then we also have the political influence that it creates. In our current political systems, where there's no caps on political donations, where there's no state funding of political parties, these people with extreme and obscene levels of wealth will always have a certain high level of influence over politics and over government. We cannot allow this happen. We cannot allow this to happen if we truly believe that we have a fair and democratic, accountable system that serves the people. And finally, extreme wealth has the effect of destroying society. It means that the people at the bedrock of our society cannot have the economic security and stability that they deserve just because they are locked out of asset ownership. They are locked out of the ownership of property. And that's why it's so important that we change the nature of home ownership in this country forever. A land value tax so that housing is no longer an asset for financial speculation, but is returned to what it truly is, a human right that everyone needs and deserves. And that also means having a proportional property tax or something different to council tax, something that replaces council tax, because the current system is regressive and wealthier people with larger homes do not pay their fair share. We need equitable systems, but our politicians have for too long decided that they can dither and delay, that the existing system and the existing order is enough. It's not enough. And we will not be satisfied because if we continue to have unfairness at the very heart of our tax system, at the very heart of our political system, how can we ever expect the lives of our people to change for the better? I think we also need a radical change in economic thinking. Andy Burnham, the whole political class itself, still acts upon the premise of the old way of thinking that taxation funds government spending, that we have to be careful not to spook the markets, that all that matters is ensuring that the markets and the financial sector has the stability and security in its gains and returns. Why do we have a system that prioritizes private gain for an elite few instead of prosperity for the majority of our people? This financial speculation and this financial gain fueled by a speculative interest economy is not serving our people. If it was up to me, we would have a zero interest economy that is not based on instability and artificial value, that actually supports people's lives rather than supporting gains in the financial sector. But also, that means moving beyond the idea that deficits are what are the problem that we should be dealing with in our country. We need to deal with the real problems in the real economy and in real people's communities and lives, not be scared of the deficit, because that's not what truly matters. As long as we have high levels of unemployment, that means our deficit is in fact too low. And the deficit is not too high because of overspending. That's not a sign of overspending. Inflation is what is truly a sign of overspending. To end this fallacy of neoliberal thinking that suggests that we cannot spend to improve the productivity and quality of life in people's communities. We can spend and we can do more to improve people's lives. We can invest in public services. We can invest in the people and the places that need investment and support the most, that have been neglected for far too long after years and years of austerity. I'm tired of this. I'm tired of austerity. People deserve funding and investment in their communities to improve their lives. We have to move beyond this neoliberal thinking. We have to move beyond it. We have to fund everything that we can. We have to improve people's lives because, as John Maynard Keynes said, anything we can do, we can afford. That has to be the premise that we base our economic thinking on, not the idea that every piece of spending that we create has to be funded by the requisite increase in taxation, or through cuts to public services, or through so called government borrowing. Why do we scaremonger so much about the bond markets? What the bond markets truly are a store of private wealth for firms and individuals. When the government provides a bond to someone, that allows them to store their wealth in a safe asset that compounds over time. That benefits them and it benefits the government too. That's how we should be thinking about the bond market. If there's a bond sell-off, or if there's any changes to bond markets, we have the power to make sure that our economy is stabilized, as we saw during the Liz Truss fiasco, which was not in fact due to reckless spending or unfunded tax cuts, but due to a lack of communication with the markets about what direction she was taking, and due to the fact that those tax cuts were aimed at the very richest in our society, which is truly a recipe for disaster. We need to move past this neoliberal thinking that suggests that we need to look towards the market before making any decision. This is a severe and unaccountable way of running our economy. It's a democratic deficit. We have to take back control of our central bank. We have to radically reshape our economic system to make sure that we have investment in people's communities, tax cuts for ordinary people, and increase limits on people's wealth. That means the people at the very top of society, not the middle classes and the aspirational people that have built their wealth through hard work and graft, but to the very billionaires that do not contribute with their extreme and obscene levels of wealth ownership. People think that these billionaires, these people who have extreme wealth, contribute so much to our society. If they truly did, then they would not have amassed such fortunes in the first place. If they truly contributed, their fortunes wouldn't be funneled into assets. They would be put into productive investment and to productive spending. But we know that beyond a certain point, there's only so much things that you can spend on. After all, if you have millions and millions of pounds, how many things are you going to buy? It's impossible to spend that much money. It's always going to go to waste. That's why we need to curtail extreme wealth. These measures of political change, these measures of radical change to our politics, to our model of economics, to our way of thinking, to the very structure of our country. These are so essential. And I don't think Andy Burnham has the radical agenda or the vision that would actually adhere to this level of change. No, I'm very optimistic about what he's proposed. I know that he is proposing a step change, but I know and I fear that it is not enough. He will bring change and he will bring renewal, he will bring improvement, but it won't be enough in terms of having something that's truly transformational. He can have an impact through his policies of improving the productivity of the state, ending neoliberalism, reducing outsourcing, putting people and places and communities back at the heart of decision making. But I think there needs to be someone else to lead this charge after he is done. This is a good first foundation, but I think that we need to move beyond that and go even further and even faster on delivering the scale and level of change that we need to see. Arguably, the most radical policy of his entire platform so far, in both his speeches that he's outlined, is his policies on housing. He's advocated a shift towards a policy called Housing First, something which Finland has. And through this policy, they have ensured that every homeless person has access to housing, guarantee of housing, no matter who they are or where they come from. And that is so important because that means we are actually providing for the people who are the most vulnerable and need the most support. We are allowing them to have security and stability. That is something which should be which I know that we can do, because during COVID we housed all our homeless people. We got them off the streets, and I know that we can deliver that sort of change again. And if Finland can do it, why can't we? And Finland has shown how we can have good, well funded public services, radically different education system that puts children's and young people's well being at the heart and at the very center of how things work. And of course, caring for the most vulnerable people. Of course, I don't advocate for the Nordic approach to immigration, which is very hostile and very against the general character of what we see. But there's a lot of merits in learning from other people's approaches. And I think as part of Andy Burnham's shift towards a collaborative politics, he also needs to learn more from the successes of other countries all around the world who have done radical things, who are looking to deliver change in new and exciting ways. And that's how we can truly build something that's transformational and great, because we don't have a monopoly on ideas. We don't have a monopoly on the best ways to fix our country. We have to take advice from all segments of society, and that also includes people from abroad too. I do think, and I know that this is Labour's last chance to change, but I genuinely did. I felt so hopeful and so excited when I heard Andy Burnham's speeches, both of them, even though they didn't go to the extent of radicalism that I wished for. They just spoke the language that I speak. They spoke of the issues that real people face, the problems that our country has been plagued with for generations. He's finally tackling them head on, and he's actually taking responsibility for failures. So many times we see politicians standing up on altars at podiums, they never take responsibility. But Andy Burnham is finally taking responsibility, and he is the only one that has decided to say that power has to be in people's hands. Andy Burnham has the potential to eradicate homelessness and substantially lower poverty. He has the potential to rebalance society in favour of the many, not the few. We cannot relinquish this opportunity for change. Andy Burnham cannot break the people's trust, because if he does, then our country will descend into a febrile state, a state of division, disunity, and decline that is beyond salvation and beyond repair. We cannot allow this reform government to come to power. We cannot allow Farage to grace the corridors of 10 Downing Street. We are seeing how his project is unravelling as revelations continue to come in, both of him and Robert Jenrick and their dodgy dealings behind the scenes. We have to keep the pressure on reform, because we know how corrupt they are, how in hoc they are to corporate interests. They will not serve us. They will not serve you. We have to stop them in their tracks. And only Andy Burnham and only the Labour Party can achieve that, because we all know that neither the Greens nor any other force in our politics has the mass appeal or the countrywide support or the countrywide platform that appeals to all segments of society or the radical vision that is required to defeat reform. Only Andy Burnham can do that, and that's why the rhetoric that we are seeing and the transformational ideas that are being put in place, they're so important to get behind, even if they don't go far enough, because we can push from within Labour and from outside to make sure that we go further and faster for delivering change. But we do know that Labour is the only hope for beating reform, and we have to put our weight behind them. Burnham has also signalled that he wants a more preventative approach towards reforming the welfare system. Instead of imposing crude cuts, he wants to change the very way that the system works. That means providing people more support instead of just financial support, and that is exactly the right approach to reforming welfare. A lot of people in the welfare system don't receive the support that they actually need. They just get given some money, they get told that they have to come in for regular assessments, but they never get given the actual support they need to turn their lives around and rebuild their lives. That's why it's so important to change the welfare system, to reduce the humiliation that people feel at degrading assessments, but also the way that we are supporting people, because it is completely inadequate. This is such an important shift, a preventative approach to welfare. Because if we tackle welfare by giving people money when they experience a problem, that is not going to be as likely to solve the problems that they face as having early intervention. That's why we need a cross-government approach. For so long, we've had governments that are so fragmented and disunited that they don't really work together across departments and across different stages of people's lives. If we have a preventative approach, both to health, to education, early intervention, local intervention, that is going to have the most impact. I've always found throughout my work in policy and through my knowledge of all of these things that when you have intervention that's early in people's lives and happens at a local level, that's the most impactful way that the state can intervene to improve people's lives. And that's the shift in approach that we have to have. A more local politics and a more active state that actually is present in people's communities to support them with any help that they may need, but also empowers them to deliver the change that they want to see. We do not need to reduce the welfare budget, as politicians on the right continue to insist that we need. They continue to say that our welfare bill is too bloated, that we cannot sustain this for any longer. Our country is being bankrupted. We are a sovereign currency issuer. We cannot be bankrupted. The true problem is that our welfare system doesn't serve the vulnerable people that is supposed to help. It's not about the budget. It's not about the amount of money that's being put against the system. It's about how we are supporting people. We need an approach of compassion across our politics, whether that is political reform, whether that's welfare. It's everything across our politics. It has to be focused on compassion and focused on people's lives, improving them. That's what politics is all about, serving the people, not personal ambition, not personal gain, and most certainly not political points made to appease media and audiences just so you can get a few clicks and a few likes on social media. If we keep scaremongering about the welfare bill, keep scaremongering about the budget, we will never see progress. We need a radical shift in thinking. It's so exasperating to continue to see every time I tune into a radio show, every time I turn on a podcast, they're all saying that the government is living beyond its means, that it's doing too much. It's not doing enough. It needs to do more. It needs to do more. It needs to do more. Lewis Goodall has also raised a crucial counterpoint to the idea of devolution and spreading power back to people's communities. That devolution could choke house building, as communities are largely likely to block housing projects in their local areas. There's still this culture of NIMBYism, especially in local councils. They're likely to block housing projects that are dictated by Westminster or any other things that would disrupt their local communities. And that is actually a real problem. We do need more house building and we do need more development. And I really think that a crucial thing is that we have more densification in our cities because we currently have housing that's very detached and very small scale. We need more high rises and more dense housing developments that are closer together so we can fit more people in the same amount of area, especially considering the growing population that we have and the strain that we are putting on housing capacity. But that's not the main point here. The main point is that devolution does have its faults. For example, some local leaders may not be competent. We may have some reform politicians running local areas, not directly adhering to the priorities of the people. But that's why we have structures of accountability in place when we do devolution, which Andy Burnham has crucially missed out. These things like citizens' assemblies, where people in local areas can hold leaders to account. That's why I always say that direct democracy is so important. We cannot just have decentralization from London and Whitehall to the nations and regions without actually providing systems of accountability to make sure that these local leaders and these powers that are distributed serve the communities that they're meant to serve. And the way that we can look at this problem of resolving this idea of NIMBYism in local areas is that we constantly convey the idea that local leaders are there to help local communities in whatever way they need. We cannot just have house building that neglects local people's concerns, but we also cannot have a block on house building because it's so necessary for the future of our country and our economy. So what we truly need, providing more power to local leaders to actually sometimes even steamroll housing projects. Because I'm going to be totally honest here. Our country has failed to build infrastructure of every kind for so many years. And we are really starting to fall behind other countries. And we are really starting to have negative impacts in our country and in our economy. People can't find housing. People can't travel short distances easily by public transport. We really do need more public investment, especially in infrastructure and especially in house building, to resolve this housing crisis that we are facing. And I think that local communities do need to recognize that. There's obviously always disruption when there are house building projects, but I do think that this is one area where some form of central authority is essential to drive through change and improvement for our country as a whole, but also for local areas. That doesn't mean their voice will be neglected, but that does mean that central government's voice should have more power when it comes to these type of decisions. I'm going to talk about how we can change Whitehall and Westminster itself, because we cannot just have decentralization from London outwards. We also need decentralization within Whitehall itself. The Treasury has far too much power over decisions. Every decision that we have goes through the Treasury's little book. Every decision that's made is looked through the lens of economic growth, GDP growth. Does it align with the Treasury's numbers? We have to change the centre of government, as the Institute for Government recommends, through an executive committee that gives renewed energy and drive to delivering the government's priorities. This would be a committee of experts and selected cabinet ministers decided based on what the government is focusing on right now. So, for example, if the current focus was the cost of living, The executive committee would be assembled of cabinet ministers related directly to the mission of cost of living and external experts related to the mission of cost of living, so that the government's priorities for that particular period of time are solely focused on that priority. This would mean that we could drive progress towards these priorities, these central core visions and tenets of the government's plan, far more efficiently and far more effectively. This would give renewed energy and drive to delivery. For too long, politicians have always complained, and the public has also complained, that our politics and our political system is not delivering for people, that the levers of power are too tightly screwed, and that we cannot turn them to achieve the difference and the change that we are trying to build. This would change that. This would mean that our politicians and our government actually has the power and the purpose and the drive to deliver change. This committee would be the most trusted and prioritized people, and that would finally give government the power and the energy to deliver the change that people are crying out for. But beyond that, we also need to split the cabinet office, the department that manages the functions of Downing Street and the center of government, into two different things. The department for the prime minister, which would support the Prime Minister in three priorities: strategy, which would focus on communication and long term delivery to make sure that the public is working alongside the government to deliver change, and so that the vision is actually long term, goes across election cycles and across governments, not just looking at short term electoral gain. The second would be policy, creating policy and having detailed plans for how to drive the government's core agenda, and evaluating the policies that are created by other departments in government to make sure that they align with the vision of government and are achieving the aims that are necessary to achieve. And finally, it would be security, which should have a focus on diplomacy and international relations. These are the three key strands of any prime minister's leadership: policy, strategy, and security. And all of these three strands should be managed by a dedicated government department. And this would also foster a whole of government approach towards decision making. It would allow all of government to send in its priorities to the Prime Minister and allow the Prime Minister to set the direction of travel far more effectively and make sure that anything that happens aligns with his vision. And that is so important, because if we have a leader that has a vision and wants to put it into place, we need to have a system that allows that to happen. This would mean that our leaders and governments can finally use their time in office effectively to deliver for the people. That is a step change that we need. And without this change, we cannot expect that anything will improve drastically. The changes that Andy Burnham is outlining are, of course, important and, of course, necessary and, of course, beneficial. But again, as is the pattern that we continue to see with Andy Burnham's pitch for the country, it's not radical enough. And until we have something that is more radical, which I think can only emerge from within the Labour Party after the foundations are laid by Andy Burnham, then we can finally see a transformative change to our country. Finally, I want to address the idea that Burnham has put forward, that there should be more stronger public control of essential services. There's been a lot of left wing outrage about Burnham's use of the term public control and the idea that this could mean strong regulation rather than full nationalisation. But this position is actually a good one, because if you look at Welsh Water, for example, or Scottish Water, which have both been nationalised for quite a long time, this has not significantly improved outcomes. We're still seeing a lot of sewage discharge and spillages there. We're still seeing bad quality, high prices, and poor service there. And as the Cunliffe Review also said, strong and evidence-based regulation is critical in ensuring customers and the environment are protected, regardless of the ownership model. Burnham is taking a very smart approach, reducing the obscene dividends that are being paid out to shareholders and company executives that exploit the private model so effectively for personal gain. He's instead allowing more public control over essential services to make sure that these essential utilities are serving the people. But he's also not going far enough as nationalisation, because that has its own drawbacks and risks. And I'm not talking about cost again. I'm not going to look at it in this neoliberal frame. I'm talking about purely evidence that's based on how well it functions. For example, we saw in HS2 that was a government project, but it had a lot of contractors and outsourcing, and that defeated the purpose of putting it under government control. And again, we don't want the same with any of our public utilities. And I want to read you an excerpt from an article that Niels Pratley wrote in The Guardian, which is quite an important reflection on this idea of nationalisation and public control. Here it is. The stronger element that Burnham could inject is more local direction, along the lines of the devolution agenda he outlined in his previous speech. The one in the People's History Museum in Manchester is the one that partly referring to. Indeed, Cunliffe's Water Commission report contained an encouragement to do so. It had high praise for how Burnham's Greater Manchester Combined Authority had played a role in showing how more regional water planning can be achieved through voluntary cross-sector engagement. So this basically means that on a regional level, services could be delivered more effectively through local control over public utilities like water and energy, which would allow local areas to have power to make sure that services work for their communities. Let's continue. The report cited a partnership between the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, the Environment Agency, and United Utilities in pulling in extra funding, prioritizing specific projects, and generally injecting more local input into planning. And that obviously would mean, this is my own words by the way, that the services at a local level work more effectively for local people, but also deliver better outcomes on a national scale too. Because if all these local services are working for the local areas and having coordination between them, then that's going to deliver far better outcomes, right? I think so too. Because again, as we've seen with centralization on a political level, that just leads to poorer outcomes. That just means that the priorities and needs of local people are being neglected, which means that outcomes aren't as effective for improving people's lives. Let's continue. One of the Commission's lesser noted recommendation was that such partnerships should be made formal via strategic boards with local political leaders on them, like elected mayors. Elected mayors should have opportunities to influence, inform, and be informed by plans for the water system in pursuit of sustainable growth, said the report. All that would seem to tick several boxes in Burnham's thinking on devolution and a sense of place. And that clearly shows that we don't need an ideological approach on nationalisation. We need an evidence-based approach. In some cases, stronger regulation and stronger public control is better than full nationalisation. As we have seen in the water sector, there's been quite a lot of investment. And in the water sector specifically, the Labour government has announced a large-scale increase of investment by private water companies into infrastructure over the next few years. That's why if we have very strong public regulation of water, I think we can deliver a far better model than if we fully nationalise it. But in some cases, nationalisation is more effective and more necessary, like energy. But even in the case of energy, retail energy companies offer quite a lot of choice and competition for consumers, and that is quite a good thing too. So we do need to have a balanced approach to the situation, not just pursue nationalisation because it's a Labour thing to do, not just because there's a public outcry to do so. We need to look at things with evidence. And I think that's a key shift that also needs to be made. That's often not mentioned when it comes to large-scale political visions, an evidence-based approach to policymaking. And that also means legislatures not just focusing on their local constituencies, but also focusing on scrutinizing large-scale legislation like the Planning and Infrastructure Bill to make sure that government's laws are delivering to the best of their capabilities to improve people's lives. Overall, whilst Andy Burnham may not be as radical as we had hoped or as transformative as we were crying out for, he will bring some prosperity, some parity, and some progress to our broken nation. This is a momentous inflection point for the renewal of our nation because it does signal a change and it does signal progress towards a new type of politics, a new settlement for our economic system and our political system. It means that people are finally at the heart of the government's vision, priorities, and decision making. This is a transformative step change, and it is something we need to have great appreciation for Andy Burnham because he is signaling that we are changing politics for good in our country. And I do remain hopeful that we will see a drastic improvement to people's lives through wealth taxation, through equalizing unfair systems, through progress in the way that our politics itself is structured. Of course, some things are still unclear, and we're going to see over the next few weeks, months, and days what is going to happen with the decisions that Burnham takes, and especially concerning could be his backroom team of new Labourites and his cabinet positions too. But I do remain hopeful, and I will continue to see what Burnham continues to do over the coming weeks. I do hope that you have understood more of what I want for our country and what Burnham wants for our country, and the fact that this is a moment of hope, and the fact that this is a chance to bring change. This is a chance to stop reform and the rise of fascism in its tracks. This is our final chance, and I do have complete faith that this project, the Andy Burnham project, will deliver what we need as a nation. This is our final chance to give Britain the circuit breaker that it needs. We cannot relinquish this opportunity and this hope. This has been Mission Undercover, and I hope to see you all next time.